You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 5th of January 2026 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Tom Edwards. Coming up on today's programme, Monocle's security correspondent, Gorana Gergic, will join us, and our Chris Cermak is here with me in London to discuss all the latest on Venezuela and the implications for both US and Trump foreign policy and for European security. Chris, there are so many angles to this one, but what are you going to be focusing on today?
Tom, I think Donald Trump is showing that in his second term, he is going to do what he says, and that is to conduct a foreign policy that is laser-like focused on American national security and conservative interests, not even democracies.
More from Chris on that in just a moment. Plus, we'll hear from our Laura Kramer in Zurich, and we'll cross to Bloomberg's newsroom for the latest business headlines too. Also ahead on today's show,
the Chinese have been strategic. There are lots of things which are less beneficial about the way China's governed, but stability, planning and consistency have proved very useful.
Isabel Hilton explains what could be in store for China in 2026. All that and more ahead here on The Briefing with me, Tom Edwards. A very warm welcome to this Monday, the 5th of January edition of the programme, which we will start with Venezuela. Deposed President Maduro is due in court in New York City today. His successor, Delcy Rodriguez, has been warned to do what's right, whatever that might mean, by Donald Trump. But the implications from the US action stretch far beyond Caracas, and indeed far beyond the borders of both Venezuela and the United States. Here to consider some of those ramifications from Zurich, Monocle's security correspondent, Gorana Gergic, is there. Hello, Gorana, how are you?
Hi, Tom. Pretty busy. I wasn't expecting necessarily that this would be the first working week of the year that we would be discussing this, but yet again, somehow unsurprising.
No, well, exactly. We'll come on to exactly how unsurprising it in just a moment, Gorana. Here in the studio alongside me, Monocle's senior news editor, Chris Cermak. Good afternoon to you, Chris, as well.
Good to be here, Tom.
And Chris, just quickly, bring us up to speed. As Gorana mentioned there, maybe none of us, rightly or wrongly, were expecting to be talking about this at this point, but just remind us what's happened in the last kind of 72 hours and where we are today.
Well, it's been such an extraordinary weekend with basically the capture of Nicolás Maduro, the former, still sort of president of Venezuela, now, as you said, being in New York, where he will face charges of drug trafficking, essentially. And I mean, watching this weekend's events, Tom, the extraordinary press conference as well of Donald Trump on Saturday. There's been a lot of confusion, as you sort of mentioned there as well, about sort of American goals here, what he means with Venezuela, running Venezuela. But I think we gained some clarity on Trump's foreign policy as well. And I just wanted to run through that quickly. When he said over the weekend that the US is running Venezuela, what he actually wants is a pliable regime in Caracas, one that will do America's bidding. It's specifically about American oil companies going back into Venezuela. There was more of a focus in the press conference even on that than, say, on drugs and that side of things. Incredible how transparent he was about that. The other thing that was striking about this weekend is it is not about democracy. He was very clear on that in the fact that in a few sentences he dismissed Maria Corina Machado, the ostensible leader of the opposition in Venezuela, and said he actually would rather probably would be willing to work with, as you mentioned, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, who's actually a loyalist of Nicolás Maduro. So far more transparently, I think, than ever before, what we've seen in this weekend is it is for Trump about American interests, conservative causes, and protection of the Western Hemisphere, his right, America's right to protect that sphere of influence. Right-wing authoritarians around the world are probably still safe. Left-wing authoritarians and even democratic opponents of the U.S., think Colombia, for example, are not necessarily safe. And that brings us to Europe, I think, and what the implications might be when they think about whether the US is a true ally of liberal democracies and Europe at this point.
Well, Gorana, let me turn to you on exactly that point. Trump cited the Monroe Doctrine. He coined the Don Road doctrine himself, unhelpfully, I thought. On that European security question, what does this mean? What's the big shakedown in terms of the the trust that these nations can have, Western liberal democracies in the European bloc, the trust they can continue or not to have in the Trump administration?
Well, not that transatlantic relations needed another strain and another point of pressure, but here it is. European governments now face a set of hard choices. How do they condemn the United States at this particular moment when they're also trying to work with the United States somehow and keep it still engaged, try to find some sort of peaceful, durable resolution to Russia's war against Ukraine. So these are things that are front and center, of course, on the agenda for Europeans. Western Hemisphere is not necessarily something that is top of the priority list for Europe as a whole, I would say. But what we've also heard are some particular voices of condemnation of what has happened over the weekend, and where we've heard, the likes of Pedro Sanchez, Spain's prime minister, condemning what he called a clear violation of international law, siding with some of the Latin American countries, but also the likes of French foreign minister, who said that the capture of Maduro contravenes the principle of the non-use of force that underpins international law. And this was actually the language that was very much infused in the statement that we've had from the European Union, from the European External Action Service, which basically said that European Union stands for the principles of international law. This was basically the second sentence, and I would say that it was not a unanimous statement. There was Hungary that was conspicuously missing from the list of countries there. So it just shows you something that Chris has already alluded to, that there are particular leaders out there in the world who might feel more comfortable with what the United States is doing, but for countries that see themselves as defenders and beneficiaries actually of rules-based order, if we can talk about, the kind of remnants of that, this is not a good time, because where we are seemingly heading is basically the kind of world of might makes right, and the kind of norms and the sets of institutions, whether they're kind of regimes and various rules and norms that we've had since the end of World War II. And we know they've been broken a number of times, but still there was a professed belief by the United States still to be pursuing them. I don't think that there's a lot of now doubts where Donald Trump stands these days and where the United States is going, given what has happened over the weekend.
Well, no, indeed. And it's funny, we'll talk probably more about not just fracture, but the sort of collapse of that rules-based order in greater depth on our programme, The Monocle Daily, in a few hours from now, also on Monocle Radio. But Gorana, just on that point about this sort of the coalition of the willing, these European powers and hopeful brokers or mediators, whatever they might be when it comes to Ukraine, they're meeting in Paris. I just wonder I don't know, how do they factor in what has unfolded over the last kind of 96 hours into their discussions around Ukraine, where we have, I don't know, a similar issue around sovereign statehood and an aggressor doing a campaign that's built on military might? It's going to be impossible to kind of discuss the one without the other, right?
Well, there will certainly be some sort of diplomatic dance, that France and Britain, who are the kind of conveners this time around, it's hosted by President Macron in Paris, that they're going to try to perform just again for the sake of it, because, United States has been so critical in convening some of these meetings. And of course, not just for the diplomatic part of it that it has kind of spearheaded, but also for the fact that, again, without all of those military enablers, Ukraine can't necessarily defend itself still just by relying on European support. So this comes, of course, the coalition of the willing meeting that comes at the sort of heels of last Monday's meeting that Donald Trump had with Ukraine's President Zelensky in Mar-a-Lago, of all places, and this has to be all about security guarantees, about weapon supply moving forward. Again, given that the United States now, I think one of the questions that will certainly loom over the meeting is that United States will be occupied elsewhere, and that it will prioritize other things. So, how much resources that leaves in terms of just attention span, time that it dedicates, when already we've seen that Donald Trump hasn't been too willing to extend some of the aid that was promised, and that there are a lot of kind of question marks over some of these things. So basically, again, really accelerating efforts on having meaningful security guarantees and helping Ukraine over the coming period.
Chris, let me come back to you on that point about Trump's foreign policy. You mentioned it right at the top and in your introductory remarks. It's, he's not a doctrinaire, and it's hard to understand if there is even a Trumpist sort of doctrine at play here. But you spoke about this sort of intentionality and that he's going to do what he said. Does that give us a hint about ongoing US foreign policy incursions? Does it hint at, as Grana was just explaining, how they might seek to manage conflicts like Ukraine or other potential flashpoints, Taiwan, any number of other theatres? How coherent is this sort of foreign policy approach that we're seeing?
Tom, for me, I think after this weekend, it is actually quite coherent, despite everything that we talk about in terms of his meandering style when he gives a press conference. But this was quite clear. Donald Trump wants to protect the Western Hemisphere. That is what he sees as his sphere, and he wants to protect American interests at all costs. That is the absolute key here, and he is going to do that without any regard for international law, or even Congress for that matter, which was also not informed about this attack. What is going to be interesting going forward, I think, only is whether he can truly wield American power in this kind of way. Because, if you compare this to Iraq or Afghanistan, America was bogged down in these wars. That's something Trump has said he never wanted to do. For the moment, that still stands. He did a laser strike on Venezuela. It took a day. It took a couple of hours. He whisks away Nicolas Maduro, and now he can leave the country and say that he's running it, even though he's not actually there. There are no boots on the ground. What if that changes? Does he get bogged down in an actual war with Venezuela if the new government doesn't do what he says? And as far as Europe or even China, that is an open question. But I think what we've seen from Donald Trump, and even from some of his comments from the last few days, is he doesn't really have an interest in it if it is not something that impacts American national security. Ukraine, he does not see as impacting American national security. He just wants a deal. Taiwan could be a similar question. Does Trump really have any particular interest in Taiwan? I'm not sure he does. And this is something that China, I think, will read into this as well and say, well, if he's focused on the Western Hemisphere, why don't we take Taiwan?
Just very quickly on the domestic US picture, and this question around, a challenge to the fundamental, or maybe misunderstandings of the separation of powers, right? The executive, the legislative, the judiciary. A strike, surgical as it may be, that was not sanctioned by any of the other sort of institutions of US government, as a number of previous US incursions have been. I don't know. It's like a coup. I mean, is it sustainable for him to prosecute these kinds of incursions in that way?
It's not necessarily sustainable, but it is interesting, I would say, when you say separation of powers. You could say in this case it was in cooperation with the judiciary. He ran over Congress and he didn't declare war on Venezuela, but the Justice Department unsealed an indictment of Maduro this weekend. So they have tried to link this very directly by saying it was a law enforcement operation. Even Trump used those words. This was not a military operation. So that is how they've tried to couch this in some kind of legality, even pointing to Panama back in 1989 and saying basically the same thing. This is law enforcement. This is about drugs, even if, as I mentioned at the outset, Trump himself has certainly couched this in different terms, saying it's about the oil and it's about American interests in Venezuela. But that's how they're trying to couch it, at least for now. Whether the American public will follow through on that, I think that's what's going to be interesting. And as I say there, it really comes down to, is America going to get bogged down in Venezuela now, or is it going to simply be able to benefit? And can Trump say, I've got a country who's now doing America's bidding, paying Americans money through oil and stopping drug trade coming to the United States? If he's able to do that, he's had a success in his American first mindset that will play for American voters as well.
Chris, great to get your insights. That's Monocle's Chris Chermak. Our Gorana Gurgic as well in Zurich. Gorana, thanks so much for being with us. Plenty happening around the world, not just in this story, but elsewhere too. Let's get a reminder of some of the global stories we're following today. Here in the other studio is Monica Lillis.
Thanks, Tom. An overnight Russian air attack on Kyiv and its wider region killed 2 people in the first reported deaths in Russian strikes on Ukraine's capital this year. Diplomatic efforts to end the war will resume this week, with the Coalition of the Willing meeting in Paris on Tuesday. The official campaign period has begun for Portugal's upcoming presidential elections. The poll has a record number of 11 candidates, including frontrunners Luís Marques Mendes from the incumbent centre-right Social Democratic Party and Antonio José Seguro of the centre-left Socialist Party. The broad field makes it unlikely that any contender will capture a majority, leading to a runoff on February the 8th. And authorities at South Korea's Incheon International Airport recorded its highest number of daily passengers this weekend, with nearly 240,000 travellers passing through its airport. This boost is attributed to an increase of passenger traffic to and from China, Hong Kong and Taiwan. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you very much indeed, Monica. More headlines coming your way just after 1300 here in London, the top of the next hour. Let's head to Switzerland next, which is, of course, still dealing with the aftermath of its tragedy in the winter resort of Crans-Montana. I'm joined now from our Zurich studio by Monocle Radio senior producer Laura Kramer. Good afternoon, Laura. Thanks for being with us to talk about this incredibly difficult story. Just bring us up to speed. What's been happening over the weekend? What's the latest?
Good afternoon, Tom. Yeah, well, just on Sunday, all 40 victims have now been formally identified, which of course will allow the families to begin mourning and the funerals to be planned. Now, we've just heard that the French President Emmanuel Macron will be traveling to Switzerland on Friday for the memorial ceremony for the victims. That's happening because 9 French citizens, including one dual French-Swiss national, were among the victims. France has also taken in a lot of the survivors who are being taken care of in their burn units. So he'll be here at the end of the week. Now, of course, the conversation has now moved along. Authorities in Valais are continuing a criminal investigation into possible negligence, and they're focusing on safety inspections, renovations, and materials that were used inside the bar. Now, in response, Lausanne, a city in the French-speaking region, has launched a preventative review. So they've asked around 600 venues to pre-examine their fire safety protocols. Also, municipalities in Bern are also conducting safety inspections of their establishments. So managers will be going around to check emergency exits, flammable materials. So definitely having a big impact on the wider country here.
Well, Laura, I was interested to ask you a bit more about that, because as well as these entirely understandable reviews of building codes, whether it's for resorts and the effectiveness or the suitability of Crans-Montana to be the host for things like the Ski World Cup, which I gather might be moved, is this prompting, deeper introspection? It would be understandable, of course, if it were. The longer term impact, I'm always struck by how high trust in institutions, in public offices across Switzerland, very high levels of shared social capital. It's quite striking if you come from somewhere like the UK. You were up obviously at Crans-Montana last week, and obviously now back in Zurich. Are you sensing that there is that degree of questioning about some of those things, or is it a little bit too soon to say, do you think?
No, I think it's definitely struck at something very fundamental in Switzerland, which is, as you mentioned, the assumption that safety systems are somewhat quietly working in the background. And I know when I came back from Crans-Montana, I looked around my own flat here in Zurich and I thought, I don't have a fire smoke alarm, actually. And then I realized it's not a requirement here, which struck me as something that's very odd. Of course, having moved from the UK, where you have to have one, and carbon monoxide one as well. So yeah, I think Swiss society is built on this high trust, high competence, efficiency. And when that is shaken, the impact really does go beyond one tragedy, one value, because people here generally don't second guess inspections or permits or enforcement. It's like you mentioned, a form of shared capital. So what's changed is that people are now asking whether the trust was misplaced or simply maybe taken for granted. And I don't think it necessarily dismantles the trust overnight, but it does really hit at the idea that this can't happen here. When I was in Crans-Montana, many of the people I spoke to had said to me, "Oh yeah, we heard something had happened, but we didn't. We figured people would have gotten out safe." So there was this implicit trust that, oh yeah, maybe there was something that happened over there, but surely everybody got out. And so once that assumption is broken, there is likely to be more pressure for tighter enforcement and more visible oversight, especially in nightlife venues.
Laura, great to have your insights. Thanks for your diligent reporting. A very difficult story to cover. Thanks for being with us today. To bring us the latest, that's our Laura Kramer joining us here on The Briefing on Monocle Radio. It is 20 minutes past midday. Time to get the latest business headlines with our good friend from Bloomberg. Ewan Potts is here. Happy New Year to you, Ewan. I hope you don't find it too late on the 5th of January for me to say that. Happy New Year's. 2026 treating you okay so far?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Happy New Year to you as well, Tom.
Thank you, Ewan. That's the pleasantries out of the way. Now, tell me, listen, we were obviously discussing this extraordinary Venezuela story at the top of the show. Tell me a bit about markets. How have they been reacting to, frankly, pretty extraordinary few days?
Yeah, it certainly is extraordinary, isn't it? But actually, the market's really taking things in its stride, at least when it comes to stocks anyway. Nothing knocking the 3-year bull run off course. This is the second full day of trading in 2026 and growth assets still in demand. And you will have heard this story last year. A key driver is our old friend technology stocks. So a number of stock markets trading at or close to record highs. But the news from Venezuela giving another boost to gold. It's trading more than 2% higher after that standout performance last year. It was gold's best year since 1979. And the gauge of the dollar is heading for its biggest gain in more than 2 weeks. The US currency is traditionally a place that investors head to in times of uncertainty. So there are a few moves around this dramatic news from South America. Interesting, though, to look at what's happening to the world's most important commodity. Brent crude is just a touch higher this morning. Earlier, it was trading a little bit lower. I think investors are having to think about the possibility of short-term disruption to the oil market, but with the prospect perhaps of a lot more supply. So there's quite a lot to think about when it comes to oil. Venezuela, of course, has the world's biggest proven reserves of oil, far more than Saudi Arabia, in fact. And it's currently not a big producer. In fact, it doesn't even make the global top 10. So that means that there's a long-term potential for a lot more oil supply and, of course, lower oil prices.
Definitely an aspect of this to keep an eye on. And Chris was talking about Trump's sort of explicit discussion of US oil interests in Venezuela in his presser. Let's change tack, but keep things US focused, Ewan, because I did want to ask you about borrowing. And if we look at the US, that we've had a bit of a sort of a word of warning, a word to the wise about borrowing levels in the US.
Yeah, a new year and a new warning about the sustainability of the US government's debt addiction. A panel of economic bigwigs say that the long-run risks posed by mounting federal debt represents a big problem for the world's biggest economy. The official forecast says that the US federal government will borrow close to $2 trillion this year. Now, that is a lot of money for an economy that is not in recession. Former Treasury Secretary and Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen is among those warning about something known as fiscal dominance. Now, that's when the size of a government's debt becomes so bloated that the central bank is forced to keep interest rates low in order to keep debt servicing costs under control, rather than its primary job, which is to contain inflation. And of course, the other problem is that inflation also erodes debt. So, for instance, let's just say you're a bit overdrawn, you've borrowed maybe $38 trillion. There is an obvious incentive there for higher inflation. Yellen has previously said that the US is in danger of becoming a, quote, banana republic if President Trump succeeds in forcing the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates in order to ease the government's debt burden. But as things stand, that $38 billion debt pile is set to top $40 billion before the end of 2026. Sorry, $40 trillion. 40 billion would be very nice.
Yeah, exactly. Listen, the numbers are so incomprehensible, you and I get them mixed up myself. But fascinated to get your take. Great insights as always, you, and thanks for that. Look forward to hearing from you again in the days and weeks ahead. That's Ewan Potts from Bloomberg joining us here on The Briefing. Finally, on today's programme, back to China, which will no doubt be evaluating what Donald Trump's attack on Venezuela means for its own defence posture. But Beijing's also preparing for a year of economic challenges after tariffs from the Trump administration have reshaped the economic landscape. Monocle's Chris Chermak, once again, we do keep him busy, spoke with Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue, about those challenges. Chris began by asking exactly how China had emerged from a year of tariff fights with the Trump administration.
China, I think, when you look back, has come out of it pretty well. It was a shock in the beginning, but it wasn't a completely unexpected shock because, Trump always blethers about what he's going to do before he does it. So the Chinese had anticipated some of that, and they had obviously put some thought into, if we're going to have a showdown at the OK Corral, what does our gun look like? So as you roll forward, there were 5 rounds of talks which led to a kind of settlement. And importantly, the meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump in Busan in South Korea, where, frankly, the Chinese, they were being talked of as a peer competitor at this point. So I think Donald Trump had discovered that he couldn't bully the Chinese through tariffs because the Chinese had this much bigger card, which was rare earths and strategic minerals. So every time he tried to beat them into submission on tariffs, they responded with rare earths and minerals. And, Western industry grinds to a halt. So, hey, do you really want this fight, Mr. Trump? Well, finally, it turned out that he didn't. So at the moment, we have a truce in that particular fight.
I mean, that shows that China are also good negotiators, I suppose. Will it have surprised them that Donald Trump backed down by the end of the year?
I think they were pretty confident, actually. And this has been a year marked by increasing Chinese confidence in this kind of negotiations. I mean, the Chinese leadership measures itself against the United States. It thinks that the United States will, if it can, stop it gaining more influence and power. And that's actually quite a fair judgment. A lot of American policy is about that. And so they have planned for many years to be resilient to those pressures. Not all of the resilience has worked out brilliantly, but they have a lot of options. So in addition to threatening retaliation on the rare earth front, you also, if you look at the patterns of Chinese trade over the past year, you see a lot of trade diversion. So diversion to emerging economies, diversion to Europe, places that the tariffs don't affect. And so China, it does need the American market, but it isn't as badly hit as it would have been.
I think what's also interesting about this and what you say there is perhaps one of the reasons that China is able to be confident on this is because it was the US, but not everyone else followed suit, which allowed China to present itself as now the one that backs free trade and telling other places like Europe and Southeast Asia, please don't close your markets as well. You wouldn't want to do that. You don't want to be protectionist, do you? This is an American thing.
It's been very interesting to watch the way the Chinese have taken advantage of the image of the United States under Donald Trump. So China, it now seems like the reliable, predictable partner, the one that isn't going to kind of turn up on Tuesday with 110% tariffs. China can now present itself, as you say, as a supporter of free trade. That's a story they tell slightly with their fingers crossed, because it's not as though the Chinese market was as open as most Western companies would like it to be to Western goods. A lot of people made a big bet on the Chinese market, and some of it paid off. Some of it ended badly. There's been a cycle now of intellectual property transfer and the Chinese becoming really fierce competitors in the industrial sector. So, for example, the German industrial economy is looking very sick right now, and that's Chinese competition. So the Chinese have been, strategic. They have the benefit of stable government. There are lots of things which are less beneficial about the way China's governed, but stability, planning and consistency have proved very useful.
But looking into 2026 and in a way sticking with this point, is there a risk that this all comes crashing down on China in part because if the US has still relatively high tariffs, even if there's been a settlement, cheap goods come flowing into other places, those places do start to close down their own markets to cheap Chinese goods because of the impact it starts having on them.
Absolutely. I mean, This goes back to the Chinese industrial model and the government support for manufacture. It's not all about government support. Chinese industry is now fantastically efficient and advanced. A lot of it is run by robots, so you have factories where you don't need to turn the lights on. And they have very, very well organized supply chains. So they're an extremely efficient industrial sector. But there is overproduction. So goods that can't be absorbed by the domestic market. And these stories are related. The distribution of wealth inside the Chinese economy is such that consumers don't have as much money as they should in a well-balanced economy, so they don't buy as much stuff. And so that stuff has to find a market. Now, what you see, it was okay as long as those goods were, relatively low technology. But now China's producing advanced technologies at a very, very affordable price. And that is causing serious alarm in Europe, but also in places like Brazil and Turkey, which, have their own industrial economies. And one negative result of all this for emerging economies is that it's pretty hopeless to imagine an industrial sector growing in the least developed countries because Chinese competition will simply wipe it out. So it's a very mixed blessing. China's had 3 decades of rapid growth. It's now in a slower growth, more advanced technology economy. But there's a whole lot of rebalancing that has to go on if it's not to have negative effects at home and abroad.
Excellent insights, as always, from Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue. Big thanks to her. And thanks to asking the questions to Monocle's Chris Jermack. That is your lot for this Monday edition of The Briefing, which was produced by Chris Jermack. I told you we kept him busy. Our studio manager was Christy O'Grady. Thanks one and all. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow, noon London time, 1300 if you're listening on CET. I'm Tom Edwards. That's your briefing. Goodbye and thanks for listening.